So I'm Mark Stewart, co-director of the Digit Research Centre with Jackie O'Reilly, and I'd just like to thank ESRC for funding the Research Centre and, of course, this Digit Debate seminar at the start. So it gives me great pleasure today to introduce my colleague, Zlatko Bodrožić, who's going to talk to us about authoritarianism, oligarchy, localism or democracy, alternative futures for digital transformation. Just a few words about Zlatko. Zlatko is an associate professor in technology, organization and sustainability at Leeds University Business School at the University of Leeds. And I know that Zlatko's very committed to in-depth theorization around changing society, changing digitalization, and issues around sustainability more generally. At Leeds, he co-leads a new research group looking at system-level sustainability, the System-Level Sustainability Research Group, or LESS. So Zlatko, I'm really looking forward to your talk today. I think you've got about 45 minutes to present, and then hopefully we'll open up for some questions and some discussion. So Zlatko, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mark, for the kind introduction and for inviting me. Can you all see the slides? Okay, great. So, where quo vadis, digital transformation? Where will we go from here? Mark already introduced me. I just would like to add that my co-author of this paper, which is the basis for this presentation, is Paul Adler, professor of management and organizational sociology and environmental studies at the University of Southern California. And so we work on these frameworks together. So everything what I say today is joint work, and the weaker parts are all from me. Just to introduce some key ideas, often digital technologies are discussed with a focus on technologies and less on organization. That is sometimes added, and even less on public policy. And so, we would like to highlight the importance of aspects of organization and public policy. And furthermore, often we look at the present and not at the past, but the past is important because if you want to understand epochal transformation processes, then we have to can learn a lot from the past, including forks in the road and collective choices which are made. And again, last point here, very often we read optimistic or pessimistic future scenarios, read about them. We are trying to outline several alternative future scenarios. Some you would argue more optimistic and others more pessimistic. So I already said our main framework is based on focusing on public policy, technology, and organization as three loosely coupled spheres which shape together the digital transformation. And our work is also based on neo-Schumpeterians. And we focus on a macro level. And one key idea is that in these spheres, you have something like paradigms, technology paradigms, public policy paradigms, and organizational paradigms. And if we analyze the trends historically and also the current trends, then and focus on the paradigms, then we can develop different scenarios. And how do we do that? Here's where we land. So basically, you already see the main outcome of our framework. We argue that the technological development will depend a lot on the choices in organization and public policy. So, and organization, we see two key alternatives, and one is top-down rationalization, and the other is bottom-up collaboration. And in the public policy sphere, we see two key choices. One is towards neoliberalism or laissez-faire policies, and the other is, so the market is dominating basically everything. And the other is a proactive system building policy regime. And if you combine top-down and laissez-faire neoliberal, you get oligarchy. If you combine bottom-up and neoliberal, you get what we call localism. And if you combine top-down and proactive, you get authoritarianism, and bottom-up and proactive system building, then you get to what we call democracy or democratization. So, and now I'm going to explain what the basis of this argument is, historically and theoretically. So historically, we look at technological revolutions. And now there is a discussion, some people say it was 4 big technological revolutions, others say more. Perez and neo-Schumpeterians usually argue it was 5, and the first one is ongoing, the age of computers and data. Some people say, well, we have now a new one based on artificial intelligence, but we would argue there is a lot of continuity, and it's rather the second half of the same revolution. And if you look at the technological sphere, what do we mean with a revolution? What's really going on? What are key concepts? And then you would say we have something like general purpose technologies, GPTs, steam engine, electricity, the internal combustion engine, the computer, which are all usable in many industries. And we have something like cheap core inputs. For the steam engine, you use coal. For the internal combustion engine, you use oil. For the computer, you use data. We have something like complementary new infrastructure. For the steam engine, on the basis of the steam engine, you can create locomotives, trains, but you need something like a railway network to make it work. For the internal combustion engine, you can create cars. With the internal combustion engine, you can create cars, automobiles, but you need highways or other types of roads to make them work effectively. And for computers, you needed the internet, something like the internet or social media. And now these important general purpose technologies are further augmented, and that was historically also the case. So now we have, for example, computers not only as one product, but we have computers in the smartphones, we have many apps, artificial intelligence, robots, and so on. So altogether, you get a cluster of technologies, which is a complex dynamic system and with a high uncertainty. And you could say that in this first half of this technological development, that the technologies are created, and then you get more and more applications in the second period, already during the first, but then more and more also during the second. But the question is exactly how will this second period look like, this deployment, what Perez calls the deployment period. And it can go into very different directions. And will we realize a full potential? And in which way will we realize it? And that depends a lot on the choices made in the other 2 spheres related to organization and to public policy. And so let's understand critical problems and choices a little bit better. So what do we mean with it? So what we say is that in all of these spheres, we had something like critical problems. For example, in the automobile revolution, at the very beginning, we had, the question was what kind of engine should be used to drive early automobiles. And then you have forks in the road. And for example, it was which is quite interesting, a discussion, will it be the steam engine car or internal combustion engine car or an electric car? And then choices are made, And at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, the internal combustion engine became the key choice, the general purpose technologies. And also in the other spheres, we have something like critical problems and forks in the road and collective choices. So, and if you look a little further, what we see in the technological sphere, that we had a development of the general purpose technologies from mainframe computers, PCs, even smaller laptops, and now we have smartphones. We had the internet, and now we have this myriad of applications related to the digital technologies. But we argue that, well, the technologies, they are evolving and they are there. The question is how they are deployed, how they are used, and that depends a lot on the other two spheres. So we argue the remaining critical problems are not technology-related ones. I mean, they are still problems, so still developments, but the key questions are now not the technology-related ones, but the ones related to the spheres of organization and public policy. That's why we say now, okay, let's turn to organization first. And what is very visible is that, and we have a lot of historical data on that, that in all of these technological revolution, we had technologies which were first used, but we didn't have a leap in productivity. Before that leap, we had to solve some radically organizational and management problems. So if you have the old paradigm of organization and you have the new technologies, it doesn't mean it gets more productive. First, you need to find effective ways of using the new technologies and create new organizational paradigms. And indeed, that happened in all the technological revolutions. And if you look now at the revolutions, I can give you examples of that. So in the first revolution, we have what we call more traditionalistic paradigms. In the second, railway-related ones, management as a profession was, some people argue, invented. So we had professional managers in the railway revolution. In the third one, related to steel, we have something which we call the factory paradigm. Then the fourth, something which we call the cooperation paradigm, and the current one we call network paradigm. And usually these paradigms developed in two cycles. And the first cycle is one which solves the foundational problems, how to use technology to get an more effective organization. And what we found is that we have something which we call revolutionizing models, which are based on a coercive top-down rationalization. So you found a way, organizational innovators found a way how to use the technologies to get towards more effective, productive organizations. And they, once they had a model, it was pushed down on the organizations. And that usually generated unintended consequences, negative consequences, often related to humans being unhappy about this revolutionizing model. And that often usually prompted a balancing model, which was based on enabling bottom-up collaboration. That resolved these human problems, or at least addressed them. Might sound a little bit abstract, so let me give you some examples. So in the second revolution, we had something which we call line and staff as a more top-down rationalizing model. And then we had something which is called industrial betterment as a more balancing model. You perhaps have heard about the third one, scientific management, Taylorism, which used a top-down rationalization in factories. And then there was human relation as a balancing trend. Strategy and structure in the fourth revolution, and then quality and culture is a balancing trend. And now we argue we are focusing on business processes, but also in a top-down manner. And we say that the balancing model is, we call it community and collaboration. It's just emerging, and that's a term we suggest might fit. And again, a little more concrete, if you look at the railway revolution, what you see here is the first organizational model. Some people argue the first in the world, which was visualized in that form, a representation of railways. So what you see here is railway lines, and it was necessary to have a clear hierarchy. So that's why we call this line and staff, because you have line managers, but also staff. But what it neglected is the life of the workers and the working conditions of the employees. So what was added to the staff were what were called welfare secretaries, that were early HR departments which cared about the well-being of workers. So that was a balancing cycle and aspect here and model, which is often called in the literature industrial betterment. In the Steel Revolution, scientific management was used in factories to rationalize production. Well, people felt like the poor Charlie Chaplin here in the picture, often alienated, often with very boring tasks. And then the human relations model tried to address that, and with a bottom-up initiatives. In the fourth revolution, we had big automobile firms, and we had people developing which was later called by Chandler strategy and structure. So instead having only one product, one automobile, people at General Motors suggested we need a car for every purpose. So if we live in the city, we need a different car, countryside, different car. If you have more money, a different car, less money, a different car. So, and then firms started, first automobile firms and others, to think about what kind of products do we need and what kind of strategy do we need to sell these products. So what kind of product portfolios we should have. And then you might have heard about structure follows strategy. People argued, yeah, for this strategy to work, we need different organizational structures, and the multidivisional form was developed as a main organizational form during this period. And the balancing model was when scholars saw that, well, that's all good. We have mass production, different products, strategy, structure. But what about issues like quality of these cars, which are mass produced? What about the question of culture that might motivate the employees? And so the balancing model was about quality and culture. I always like to visualize this organizational form. So the multidivisional form. What I try to visualize here is that you have 4 autonomous divisions. Okay, for example, each of the divisions focusing on one product family, for example, on one type of car. And each of them have suppliers and clients. And what a key, so that is a quite decentralized form with multiple divisions. And what a key characteristic is that they were all quite separated, autonomous in a sense, but also with a lot of boundaries. So, and we can find this model everywhere. Look at our universities. Okay, many of us work in the faculty of business, right? But how much contact do we have to the other faculties, to the faculty of the environment, to engineering? Often not very much. Okay, because our model is, well, we need to be autonomous. We need to make our own decisions, have our own students, organize our own courses, and so on and so on, our own research. It's all good. But as you see, that might produce silos. And that indeed is one of the key problems, the shortcomings of this form, which is as I said, visible in many organizations today, in many firms still, but also universities, government institutions, and other organizations. So we argue that the current organizational paradigm is related to networks, and we call it the network paradigm. And we say that the two key models, which are opposing each other and fighting basically for dominance, are the business process model and the second, the community collaboration model. And why business process model? Well, we were inspired, if you remember, by the first organizational innovations in the 1990s, which were focused on redesigning business processes. Business process reengineering was very popular in the 1990s. And indeed, it was inspired by the idea that we need to overcome these boundaries in organizations. So we might not need all these different divisions and departments. It's possible to radically simplify processes, business processes, by using ICT. And BPR, business process reengineering, was a very brutal form, if I might say so. So Hammer, who was a main person and was known as having a very strong language and something, he said something, for example, something like carry the wounded, okay, carry the ones who want to go with us, but shoot the others. If they are making problems, shoot them. And what he meant is kick them out, get them out the organization, either fire them, but more often, very often, what happened is outsourcing, downsizing, that many firms said in the 1990s, we don't need these people anymore. They can let them find other kind of work. Many IT consultancy firms diffused this model, and now we do not hear the term business process reengineering very often anymore. But we know that we think often in processes. Think about supply chain management. We often think in global processes and how to optimize global or local processes. So we do believe that this thinking in processes is still very dominant, and it's still very much top down. And what we also see is that this model was criticized a lot, and some of the critics were, and even Davenport, one of the innovators, said, "Oh, we forgot something. We forgot humans." So humans were forgotten in the system, because indeed it was a very rationalizing model, kicking people out. But what about the social fabric of communities in many organizations? What about the innovators which work together to create something new? And if you kick half of the firm out, and some of them were really important people to collaborate with, then you harm your own innovation capacity. So what we see as a new emerging model, an alternative, is the community and collaboration model. That's how we call it. People think much more in terms of communities and collaborations. There's a guy in Germany, Stefan Gold, who says we have to think much more about the base of the pyramid. So the many workers, or the many people in communities, in countries which are not top, at the top of the organization, at the top of the pyramid, but the base of the pyramid. And so there are a lot of concepts around that. And let me show you some contrasting concepts. On the left side, business process reengineering, redesign, downsizing, outsourcing, and the alternatives in the community and collaboration model, something like open innovation, innovation ecosystems, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding. Platform organizations are very interesting. So we see that big tech firms think a lot in business processes. So Uber is basically almost only processes, and much of them are algorithm or AI controlled, but very much top down. So the employees have very little say about what is going on, and about the algorithm and whether it's fair or not. But we have different examples. For example, we have platform cooperatives, and from the same industry, because I mentioned Uber, there is an Austin-based ATX taxi cooperative, also using platforms, but empowering employees. And that, we would argue, is a key difference. And to give you just a picture what is happening related to platforms, we think that there is a movement from the old paradigm, which we call the cooperation paradigm, with all the boundaries, with the multidivisional form, towards platforms. So you redesign business processes, you can bridge, transcend internal and external boundaries. You can use disintermediation. So sometimes really you don't need some of the employees anymore. So you can radically simplify processes. But the question is, does this happen top down or bottom up? Is a community empowered, or is a community just a rhetorical addition? Oh, we are all about the community, but actually the community is without any power. So this question of power, we argue, is a central issue. So again, contrasting both business process on the left, you have a lot of power asymmetries, and it's about value extraction, and use technology to eliminate labor. On the right side, you build shared power, you enable value creation, and use technology to augment labor capabilities. So now I presented to you the two alternatives. We think that it's rather going either in the business process direction, with a dominant business process model, dominant top-down rationalization, or we will see a different model emerging or getting stronger, which is cultivating bottom-up collaboration, and which we call community and collaboration. So these are we say the two main alternatives in the organization sphere. Now that is all good, but it's not sufficient if we want to understand the future development of digital transformation. But we need to understand also what is going on in the public policy sphere. And in the public policy sphere, we have to have a closer look at the technological revolutions. And we see that often in the first half of these revolutions, we had something like laissez-faire policies dominating. And laissez-faire means basically you leave the market shapes the revolution. Okay, the state is saying, okay, the market will find a way with its invisible hand, and investment will go towards new technologies, and then we will modernize in a fast way. So the problem was, yes, you got these investments, but you also got manias. So investments which were creating bubbles. So in each of the technological revolutions, we see different forms of manias towards the middle of the revolution. In this revolution, we saw the internet mania, but also the financial casinos around housing. So, and what happened is that in all these revolutions, around the middle or a little before or a little after, could be a longer period or a shorter period, you had crisis, strong crisis, often financial crisis because of the manias. You had financial shocks. Probably the most well known is the one of happening in 1929 and causing the Great Depression, but also the current ones are really important ones, which we had 7-8 years ago. And it's important to say that the crisis in the middle is not only a financial crisis, it's also a social crisis, because all these revolutions create winners and losers. And so, for example, IT people, data scientists, specialists in data and artificial intelligence, they are the winners. They will have good jobs now and they can choose their jobs. But if you look at the employees in the older industries, they are often not the winners, but they have to fear they might lose their job and their social status might go down. And if you look to the US, actually a considerable number of these people is now not only without a job, but without a house. So, and you had, that's very strong in the Great Depression of the 1930s. And Carter Perez and we argue that we are now in a similar period like the Great Depression. But it doesn't have to end there. Very often there was an alternative then increasingly discussed during these crisis periods. And the alternative is something like a system building regime. So the state is not anymore saying the market will deal with everything, but we need to create systems. We need to create technology systems, infrastructure, but also social systems like welfare systems or other systems. So, so what I already told you, you see here summarized that you could have system building regimes supporting public value creation, and the probably best after the crisis period, and probably the best example about that is the New Deal and the war production policy of Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s. For our understanding, it's important that in the first half of these revolutions, when you had laissez-faire, so the market dominance, it often didn't lead what some people, some neoclassical economists think, oh, then we have a perfect market and everyone can give me part of the market and so on and so on. And what in reality often happened is you had giant firms and very powerful oligopolies. Okay, in the railway revolution, you had giant firms, giant railway organizations, and they had enormous political power. You see the railway magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt. In the steel revolution, you had the steel firms became the biggest firms in the world. US Steel in 1902 became the largest firm in the world. And the owners of steel firms, for example, the key figure here was the steel magnate J.P. Morgan. Now you know where the name of the bank is coming from. They had an enormous, and not only economical power, also political power. In the automobile revolution, the owners and top managers of automobile firms had an enormous political power. And you might remember the saying, what is good for the country is good for General Motors and vice versa. So General Motors was very important, and automobile firms very important for the US, and its owners and leaders had often high-ranking, had a lot of influence, but even high-ranking positions in governments. So another issue which might be interesting is the power of oil firms in the same revolution. Okay, so taking Exxon as an example, Exxon knew about the climate problem. Exxon knew already in the 70s, there were studies in the beginning of the 1980s that greenhouse gases might lead to disastrous consequences, but they deliberately chose, and that's the research of Michael Mann showing, to do not research which is pointing towards that and highlighting the dangers, but rather financing climate change denial. And And you see, for example, as a consequence, that's our hypothesis and Mann's hypothesis, that today many people in the US still think that climate change is not real. And if you have powerful firms like Exxon financing research and other stuff related to that, then you can explain why that is the case. So these firms all held a lot of power. And if you ask now, what about the current revolution? The answer is very simple. You have Google, you have Apple, Facebook or Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft, and you see the power they have. And not only that they have these network effects with their own firms, they own the communication infrastructure, and they can acquire smaller firms. So, for example, there was a British AI startup, very promising, which is DeepMind, is now acquired by Google. So, and owners of these big firms like Jeff Bezos can bought the Washington Post, Musk bought Twitter. So, important communication infrastructure is privately owned and enables private company to decide what is discussed and what is an intellectual no-fly zone. So, and that is troubling indeed. So, but I also said there were other initiatives, and there were system building initiatives, and these system building had also consequences, often more felt in the second part of these technological revolutions. For example, there was a comprehensive US railway system. There was a comprehensive electric grid. There was a motorway transport system, and other system building reforms related to the New Deal, like the welfare state, union institutionalization. And we didn't see that only in the US, but also in the UK and other European countries. We saw the system building measures in the 1930s, 40s, and afterwards. So also system building regimes had consequences. So, and the current system building regime, which we see as well, the idea about a system building regime, which we see as promising, is the framework of Mazzucato. And Mazzucato wrote about a lot about the state and the market. And
5 minutes, Zlatko.
Oh, thank you. So, and she talks a lot about state orchestrated missions addressing the grand challenges and creating public value. So I could tell you more about Mazzucato and about her idea, but because I have only 5 minutes left, I will jump to the two alternatives, and that is the laissez-faire direction on the one hand, okay, which I discussed. So you trust laissez-faire or neoliberalism, you trust in the market, and you trust in private and corporate systems, or you go for a proactive public policy, a system building regime, which creates goods and services in the public interest. And now I hope you understand a little more how we came to our framework. So you have current critical organizational problems and alternative options, and critical public policy problems and alternative options. And the alternative options inform the two alternatives and the four choices. So oligarchy, localism, authoritarianism, and democracy. Just to give you a brief overview about each of them. Oligarchy, here's a nice picture of Google. Okay, the public policy regime is neoliberalism. The coordination mechanism is market. The management model is business process. You rely on hierarchy. Example is the US. And the technology sovereignty is ceded in many aspects of the corporate sector. Data platforms are controlled by big tech firms. And you can read a lot on that in the great book of Shoshana Zuboff on surveillance capitalism, but also on other literature, e.g. the paper on knowledge predation of the big tech by Riekeb and Lundvall. Second alternative is you have not laissez-faire, but a proactive system building policy regime, but you stay with hierarchy. And if you combine this strong state hierarchy, you get what we see as authoritarianism. Example is Singapore, also China. The data platform is a surveillance system. And that's what you have in Singapore. You have a biometric database comprising facial images and identities of all citizens. And then you can just use that to surveil your citizens. The state would argue we do that to prevent crime, but they also use it for other means, for other goals. So that's authoritarianism. Third one, localism. If you stay in the neoliberal policy regime with a market as a coordination mechanism, you still could go for to try to have the community and collaboration model to organize yourself. And indeed, in some local jurisdictions, for example, in Barcelona, that worked. And then the technology sovereignty is in the hands of the local community. You have something like city data commons controlled by local citizens. You have cooperatives, small-scale firms, non-profit organizations. I love these models, and you can learn a lot from them. The problem is how to scale them up, and often they remain local. Okay, so higher levels of government are not touched by these, often not touched by these local developments, and then they remain local and not very influential. That's the problem with that. The fourth one is digital democracy. You have the community and collaboration model like in localism, but you combine it with a proactive system building policy. That means that citizens, through constitutional ensuring, own the data. You have a lot of new public systems. You have a national digital infrastructure, and it's led by citizen groups and public sector organizations. You can read about that in Mazzucato's work. So that's the alternative. Okay, now you understand a little more about the four scenarios. We use that as a heuristic. That means we see the four scenarios as corner solutions, and then we can analyze countries, for example. Okay, if we want a fast analysis of countries, we would argue that China is leaning towards authoritarianism, the US towards oligarchy, Europe is somewhere in between. Barcelona would be an example of localism. That is a tentative analysis, but you usually have to go more, analyze the details into the sectors or countries. So if you would like to discuss how we can go towards digital democracy, we would need to analyze more specific sectors and countries. And we did some research, for example, in the pub industry in the UK. And what you see is that the number of pubs is decreasing in the UK. Okay, and that is not good because you have a social death of small towns. And one reason why the number of pubs is decreasing is the pub industry is dominated by corporate pub chains, and they just close pubs if pubs are not profitable. We could then imagine we could try to move towards democratization. So these pub chains use digital technologies, and we might imagine, hey, can we somehow push these pubs to use the digital technologies somehow for the public good? But we don't think that will work. Instead, what we try to study is community pubs, which are examples of localism. But these pubs has a problem that they often don't have the resources for digital technologies. But what about if we would move towards a network of these community pubs, state-enabled, the state enabling a digital system for green community pubs? That is something that might work, and that is something we are currently doing research about. So that might be a path, combining localist ideas and then trying to create a system which is strengthening the localist ideas, but also benefiting from digital technologies and economies of scale. Okay, I could tell you a little more how sticky.
And you conclude, please,
yes.
Zlatko. We want to leave some time for some questions. So
that's right. So I could tell you a little more about why this is a difficult path, but let me conclude instead. Why is that so difficult, this development we are in? And so because digital democracy nor an effective green transition will happen automatically, but they could be achieved if we would push for a system building state, deploying digital technologies, and pushing for a proactively for a social environmental sustainability. But for that implies multiple paradigm shifts. It's not only about the technologies, it's also moving from neoliberalism to a proactive system building policy regime. It's moving from top down to bottom up. And we need social movements to accomplish that. That's an important factor. But if you look at the research we are doing, that's my last statement. With that, I would like to conclude. We see a lot of good scholars who are interested in topics like that, like the democratic participation and bottom-up initiatives. And so if you would combine these different ideas and work together, I think we have a chance to do something to inform a green democratic scenario and a transition towards a democratic digital democracy, digital democratization. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Zlatko. So we'll take some questions now in a minute. And can I ask colleagues to turn on their cameras so we can make it a little bit more personable? I've seen that there's been a few questions in the chat, which I'll ask colleagues to come forward and ask their questions in a minute. But if people can also put up their hands, that would be good. And while people are maybe thinking of their questions, I'll maybe start. I think that was an incredibly ambitious presentation, incredibly ambitious piece of work in terms of what you're trying to do here. And I'm sure people could engage with you on many, many levels. I think you did a great job in terms of mapping historically different forms of corporate organization, different challenges, and other different options that might be available. But a lot comes down to these collective choices, some forks in the road. And I think there's a big question over why certain choices are made and why, when there's a fork in the road, the choice is in one direction rather than the other. And I'm not sure you really, I think that's something to be developed. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about that, because you talked a bit about human problems and balancing responses, but there was no discussion until the very end about social movements or about the role of labor or about the capital labor struggle and how that might shape particular types of response. You know, I mean, if you read, say, Polanyi, for example, talks about the destructive nature of self-regulating markets, and essentially they can never fully exist apart from their, you know, as a theoretical idea, because there will always be some sort of counter movement. Well, I didn't get any sense of where those counter movements were in the different historical points that might have shaped collective choices to go down one particular fork in the road rather than the other. I guess it's an observation. I'm not sure if you can answer that question, but it's a sort of observation in terms of what I would have liked to hear a little bit more of in the presentation.
Yes, well, I fully agree with you. I just, at the very end, I mentioned that social movements are important. So I didn't talk much about the actors
exactly
in this presentation. And
apart from capital.
That's right. So the reason is basically when we developed these papers, this is a very complex story. And then we started with the organizational dimension and then the public policy dimension. And we also try to add always a little bit about the actors, but it just gets too much for a paper to be published. It's impossible to do that, or it's very difficult to do that in papers. But we definitely are working on that issue. And indeed, you would say that social movements were absolutely essential and pushing for the system level and also for the bottom up. So, and there could be different social movements. And indeed, as you say, the workers' movement and the union movements were absolutely essential in all of these crisis periods. And the challenge I see currently is that the workers' movement is not very strong. And it's also the movements are pretty divided. That we have, maybe it's not fully fair if I say that it's more kind of middle class movement, which is about around green. And then we have the workers' movement, which is not so much concerned about the green issues, but more about that their life is getting more difficult by the day. And we have the same problem, by the way, with the developing countries, which we tell them, hey, you think green, and they say we are living in poverty. So we have to take care of that first. So okay. That's a big issue. That how can we bring these movements together?
Okay, I'm going to just invite a few colleagues to present their questions. So Simon Deakin, you posted a question around platforms. Would you like to put that to Zlatko or ask something else if you'd rather?
Hi, Zlatko. Thank you for your talk. Well, just picking up on Mark's point, if we think about workers' counter movements to platforms, actually there has been this debate recently, hasn't there, about Amazon in America and trying to unionize. It's very difficult under US labor law, but they are having some success. In the UK, and in fact globally, really, Uber is regarded as a transport business. I mean, you may think that's a purely legal perspective, but there are lots and lots of cases in which Uber workers have established worker-like or employee-like rights to the minimum wage. That's not really surprising, actually, because Uber does appear very much to be running a business which needs workers, no matter how hard they try to deny it. So my feeling is that one has to very carefully distinguish between what's new and what's old. I mean, in a nutshell, I think the platform is just a scaled up version of the loom, and that digitization is something that's been happening for centuries. Of course, the new technology creates particular pressures and really empowers capital at this stage of the cycle in a way that's actually, again, something we've experienced in the past. You know, there might be a Polanyian pushback, as there has been in the past. I was reading an interesting paper by Evgeny Morozov in the New Left Review the other day, which discusses theories of, the entrepreneurial state, Mazzucato, and so-called neo-feudalism. And the paper is quite interesting because it kind of ends up saying, actually, it's really still capitalism. Capitalism doesn't figure much in your paper, actually. I was looking for that and didn't really see this. And I wonder if it could be part of your analysis.
I think to start with your last point, capitalism is the underlying economic system pushing the technological revolutions forward. So it's the underlying logic of everything I basically have spoken about. And we try to kind of operationalize the different aspects of it in the talk. I would say that there is something new in platforms. I would say that in a sense, each technological revolution basically restarts if you go to Marx and your framework, it restarts the question of capital and labor, and then the question of what happens then, and the prior technological revolutions, there was a counter movement, and now not so much of it, and then we see all the examples are basically very much in favor of oligarchy, very strongly. And indeed, it's puzzling for me. You could talk about the alternatives and unionization. I think that's very important. But let me put another idea on the table, and that is, in the last revolution, we had something like Airbus, okay, as a counter example to Boeing, and it could have been much more public organization. But no, we don't even have that in Europe. We don't have a larger, let's say, ideally public organization on digital technologies like Google. Where is the European Google? The European Amazon doesn't exist. Europe wasn't even capable of creating that. You would need a public organization on that. So China has authoritarian systems like that. The US has the corporate systems, and Europe. So that's pretty weak. So even you don't have to be like a lefty or to argue like that. Someone like de Gaulle or Mitterrand, it would be sufficient to say, hey, we need something like that.
Okay, I'll just bring in another colleague, Amani Albana. Amani, would you like to put your question? You asked about business processes as a top-down model.
Yes, it's for me. I was just wondering, because this is at the very core of your model. So at the very core of it, I felt that it's an incredibly ideal version of a community that is not exactly related to how communities work. So research on communities, whether it's a platform community or crowdsourcing community or open source community, would show that these communities work with a structure and they work with processes. So in your presentation, you were presenting a very romantic, if I may say that, about communities as they are people hugging each other and they are just working without absolutely no structure whatsoever. But this is against most of the research in this area. So would you just explain perhaps your idea a little bit further? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I think that's a great question. So I think that was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean that at all, this idealistic type of community and hugging each other, although I like hugs. But what we meant is the business process model is challenged. It's not anymore a top-down model. The processes won't go away. But the question is who controls the processes and who has the power there. And that could be a bottom-up, and it could be done by different types of communities. So if the community model, the community and collaboration model would dominate, it wouldn't destroy all the processes, but it would rather take the control over these processes from a bottom-up perspective. And how that exactly looks like, you need a lot of different concepts related to that. And crowdsourcing and open innovation are just two. Community of purpose and many others are developed. So this, what we call the community collaboration model, is a rather basic idea of a different approach with various concepts which could contribute to that.
Yes, but if you take this, just I'll come back quickly. If you take this, you will see that in China, they are adopting what you are exactly saying as well. So this would kind of now dismantle this idea of community from the political system. So this might need maybe a little bit of debate outside the digit debate, considering the time. But yes, thank you.
What I have seen in China, it's rather top-down, I have to say, and very little. When I was teaching in China, most was top-down, I have to say, and my colleague Paul Adler, who studied this a little more, he said there is no civil society in China who has a strong input from the bottom up. So it's a lot of top-down processes, and so I would disagree here. I would say in China most is top-down. There might be bottom-up initiatives, as everywhere, but I don't see them very much supported by the state. Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, thanks, Zlatko. We're pretty much out of time, and I can see a few people have already left. One of those who has left, Steve Rolfe, has put some comments in the chat, which we'll pass on to you. And I think there's a few other comments now coming in the chat as well as people are leaving. But I'll open it up if anyone has one final question they want to put to Zlatko. No, in that case, we'll close today's session. There were some comments that have just come up, Zlatko, but I'll just send those on to you. We'll send those on to you in the chat. So. If colleagues can fill out the feedback form in the usual way. And I think Gemma also wants us to highlight that there's going to be a session next week by Brendan Birchall and David Frayne, looking at the COVID pandemic and the resurgence of the shorter working week. So I hope colleagues can make that session as well. Zlatko, I want to thank you for what was a really excellent presentation today. I think it's incredibly thought-provoking. It's an amazing and ambitious piece of work that you're doing, maybe impossibly ambitious. But I really like the options that you've put on the table, and I think there's a lot of food for thought for all of us there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And maybe if I can end with taking up your "It's impossible." In the current situation we are in with climate change, we have to be realistic and try the impossible with Che Guevara. Thanks a lot.